Hey there and welcome back. I hope that you are just as kind of interested and excited as I am about the new background. We are adding some plants, adding things to the wall, but that's not what we're talking about today. Today we are talking about how to do this painting right here. It's done on a 7x9 canvas board. We use acrylic paints and we're going to talk about all of it. Painting the stars in the sky, the pink reflections on the rocks, and of course the waterfall as well. So it's a fairly fun painting. We do a lot in it, but it's also kind of different and has kind of more of a surreal sky. So we'll have fun with that. As per usual, if you'd like help with the drawing process, there's a link in the description to the Patreon where you can find the digital sketch, which you can print off or use the grid lines to sketch out. I personally really like using grid lines when I'm drawing anything. I know that when I try to do things multiple times, I tend to skew my drawings, and they aren't always exactly how I want them to turn out, but the grid lines really help me kind of keep everything right where it should be. Also worth noting, over there on Patreon, you can also get the full hour-long version of this. You can get the 40 other hour-long lessons as well, and you can get reference photos and things like that. It's a great way to help out the channel and keep the studio lights on, which aren't actually on because, again, I only film in natural light. It's not a good joke, but I'll keep making it because it's all I've got. Anyways, thank you for putting up with me. We're going to have a fun time today. We're going to paint, we are going to learn, and we are going to just have a good time. So let's jump into it. We're going to jump into today's tutorial with a larger, damp, square-headed brush. We're going to use this because it can hold a good amount of paint and because the sharp edges are going to allow us to work around our subjects in the middle ground and foreground with ease, as they're very defined. Then I'm ensuring that the brush is damp to extend the wet life of my paint and help me drag it out a little bit farther. From there, I'm going to my palette. I'm grabbing about an equal mixture of primary red and titanium white. I'm applying it to the base of my sky, kind of cutting around my mountains, and then I'm blending upwards. I'm then progressively adding more titanium white to it, brightening and thickening the pigment. Then here, as you can see, I'm going back to my palette and I'm mixing up a good combination of primary blue and primary red. Then I'm throwing some additional titanium white in it as well, and I'm applying this on top of our first application of the pink. Then I'm going to begin blending the two together fairly softly, as you can see here. Now, I should be able to do this with relative ease because my brush was damp. The pink should still be wet as the water does extend the wet life, and it helps you create a much softer, large application like in the sky. So that's what I did there. Then I went on to creating a darker mixture. This one has much more primary blue in it, and I'm going to apply this to the top of my sky and then begin to blend downwards. Here I'm taking the smaller round-headed brush. I'm grabbing a lot of water. I'm grabbing a little bit of titanium white, mixing the two to the point where I have very much a water-heavy mixture. Then I'm peeling back the bristles on the smaller round-headed brush, and I'm launching this paint at the canvas. And this is a fantastic way of making stars for a couple of reasons. One, it's incredibly quick and easy. You get just hundreds of stars with such ease. You're also creating a vast variety of stars. Some are larger, some are smaller, some have a little bit of a direction in them as well. You're also creating clusters, so you're creating a lot of diversity in your stars, and that's important when you're rendering realism. I'm now, for the most part, done that first part of the sky. I need to let it dry before we go back in. We add in the clouds and the additional stars, and in the meantime, we're going to go down into the middle ground slash background, the mountains, and kind of do the base layering. So here I have an even mixture of titanium white and Mars black. Mars black is a bit of a stronger pigment. It will overtake the titanium white, so it will be a bit of a darker mixture, but that's okay. That's just what I want for this. We're going to build highlights and midtones on top of it after. But here, essentially, I'm just kind of sketching in what I want. I'm using the medium-sized square-headed brush because it can hold a good amount of paint, and because that sharp edge is fantastic fantastic for working along the edges of subjects like our mountains. I essentially have the base layer of those mountains blocked in, and I'm going to switch over to a smaller square-headed brush. This one can hold a little bit less paint, but it does get a bit more of a fine, sharp edge, which is exactly what we want for the detail work. So I'm grabbing a pink, something similar to what we had in the sky. Maybe it has a little bit more titanium white in it, just so it stands out a little bit more. And I'm going to begin applying this in a bit of a tapping / dragging motion. Now I'm grabbing an older square-headed brush, and I'm going to take some primary blue with this, and I'm going to begin working on some stars, some clusters of them, up into the sky. So I'm doing this with the tapping effect, and as you can see, we're getting a lot of different implications on the canvas. I'm using a very minimal amount of pressure so that it's fairly transparent in my initial applications, so that I can kind of play with it and I can build up with it. And I'm also going to really brighten this as well. So I'm going to take some titanium white, I'm going to mix that over here, but we're using this older square-headed brush because when you make a tapping motion with it, you get a full litany of different implications. Very much in the same way when you launch the paint at the canvas, here we're getting something that's always different, always evolving, lots of little applications that are smaller than we would have been able to achieve with any other little brush. And it's because each individual kind of bristle is applying its own application and creating its own little implication on the canvas as well. So as I'm doing this, I'm slowly just adding more layers. Again, I'm using a very, very minimal amount of pressure. That is highly important in this application. You want almost each of your applications to be semi-transparent, and then with each following application, I'm adding a little bit more titanium white and I'm brightening it slightly. So through this process, we're going to eventually get something that is full of highlight, as you can see, but we're going to get there slowly, and we're going to get there progressively, ensuring that each step is exactly what we want it to be. Now here I'm taking my medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm taking the pink that we used in our first application. I'm essentially yet again lining the base of the sky, and then I'm going to blend up very softly. This brush has a lot of water on it, so we're getting a very transparent aesthetic, and I'm essentially going to try to build some clouds up back into the sky. I'm going to jump now down into the middle ground / foreground. I'm doing so with the larger square-headed brush. Here I have a mixture of a little bit of titanium white, a good amount of Mars black, and a little bit of primary blue as well. And this is essentially going to be the rock that the water falls down on in our waterfall. Now, I'm allowing the application here to be a little bit rough because we are going to be working with rock and we're going to have a lot of water covering it. So essentially, I'm just building a base layer to make it look like there are slight areas that protrude and have slight highlights. Now here, I'm going back to the older square-headed brush. Here, I'm mixing up a bit of a green. It is a mixture of a primary yellow and a Mars black for the most part. And I'm using these two colors to make green as opposed to a primary yellow and a primary blue, because a primary blue and a primary yellow generally render a much more fresh, bright green with a bit more levity in it, whereas a Mars black and a yellow oak, and a primary yellow rather, render a green that's much more heavy. It's much more of an olive and it's much more rich. So I like this color much more for nighttime scenes. You could mix it with the primary blue, as the blue would look nice with the rest of the sky, but I wanted something a little bit darker, a little bit heavier, a little bit less saturated as well. I have some primary red and I have some titanium white. I'm applying this here on to the stream area, and the stream, not blue. Not the color we would innately think of as water, and that's because we have a pink sky and the light is going to reflect down onto it. Now here I'm taking a bit of a pink. It's a very dark pink, but I'm essentially just throwing on some highlights to the tops of the rocks on our waterfall area. And I'm doing this here so that we kind of have a slight roadmap of where we want our water to fall from and what it's kind of moving around. Now I tend to deviate from this initial sketch as I move through the waterfall, but it's a good starting position and it gives us something to work from so that we're not purely guessing. Then I'm using the smaller square-headed brush, and a mixture that's closer to gray. It has a little bit of additional color in it. But I'm essentially creating a lot of little lines that are creating the effect of water falling. Now at this point, I'm switching over to the smaller square-headed brush. You could also use a liner brush in this situation. But here I'm doing more of the same essentially. I'm adding the highlights to the top, I'm dragging my brush down, I'm using fairly thin applications, and I'm building up these highlights. Here though, you can see I'm doing a lot of the shape work. With that little piece of water that I worked on there, it kind of moves in from the left, it moves in from the right, it converges in the middle, and then it falls. Whereas other ones kind of just fall straight from the left, from the right. And it's this difference in amalgamation of them, which is going to make it so much more interesting. Now we're moving up to the top of the water, and we're using a bright pigment for this. It's time to start incorporating those highlights now that we have a good idea of the movement within our water and the shapes that kind of make it fall and what it's falling on. So now that we have something definitive, we can put something much more concrete on the canvas. Another reason that we did it all so clear initially was so that we could take time to just kind of map everything out, so that we could make more mistakes without kind of larger repercussions. I could just kind of continuously paint over it, right? So it was a good way of practicing and getting a really good start with the painting. Now, going back into the painting, yet again, I'm using this medium-sized square-headed brush, and I'm essentially just blocking in my trees. Now, I've lost some of the drawings from the trees here, so I'm kind of making them up as I go. However, alternatively, if you've also lost your line work because pigment is now on top of it, don't you worry, you can go back to the start of the video and see where it was all drawn, or you can look at the digital sketch and work from that as well. Alternatively, you could do exactly what I'm doing here, and that's ignoring both of those options and just continuing to paint and replot them in whatever way you think will be most aesthetic to the rest of the painting. Here I'm going to begin working on the cliffs that are more so in the foreground. Here we're using a Mars black, a bit of a burnt umber, the larger square-headed brush because of its nice sharp edge, and again because it can hold so much paint. I'm using that pigment over on the left hand side, then I'm going over to the right hand side, and I'm doing this to ensure that both sides have a fairly similar pigment. We can go back to our palette, we can mix more paint, we might get it close, we might not, but by doing it right now, we ensure that at least both sides share some of the same colors, and we're going to get something that is cohesive, at least in that. Now here I'm applying some rock here in the foreground. It has a good amount of burnt umber in it. I also have more of the pinks and that sort of color in it as well. And I'm using this here because we are much more in the foreground. Remember that the mountains could have had these colors. Remember that the waterfall could have had these colors. But this is much more close to us, so we get to see more of that natural coloring rather than the reflected light. So here is where we have the opportunity to build in more of those burnt umbers. We'll also add in the highlights from the reflected light as well, but we'll build it up slowly, as you can see here. I'm also creating a lot of these rocks with a bit of a tapping motion, trying to get a little bit more of a grit in it and ensure that there are little protruding pieces and divots in that rock as well. You don't want your rock to look too soft. You don't want all of the edges to be too round. Ensure that some of them are sharp, some of them are round, and you have a good mixture of the two. Then I'm going to continuously go back to the edges of the rock and add more highlights. So I started with the darker base layer, then I added a mid-tone to connect it, and then on the very edge, the area that's going to be facing the light the most, I'm adding much more of a highlight to that, and I'm building up that highlight slowly, because when you first apply that highlight, it's going to inevitably blend back into the mid-tone, and we won't get that pure highlight. We'll get a mixture of the two, right? So then you can go in and add highlight again, or an even heightened highlight to that edge, and then blend that into the initial highlight. And every time you add that extra value into the mix of dark, medium, light, etc., you add more depth to your piece. It looks a little bit more real, especially in the foreground. Here, I'm creating some foliage. I'm applying it around portions of my rock on the left and the right hand side. I'm starting with the darkest pigment with the old square-headed brush. I'm using that tapping effect that we used for the tops of the trees, and then I'm building up highlights. Here the highlights are much more green than they are pink because we are much closer to us. There's much less reflective light and we can see those colors much more naturally here, right? So now up top in the trees we have trees with highlights, and those highlights are pink. Whereas here we have bushes and trees with highlights, and those highlights are more of a dark green, as you can see. Now here I'm going back up to the tops of the painting, and I'm creating some of the foliage, as you can see here, from the actual trees. Now this is being done in the same tapping effect that we used on the initial trees and on the foliage that we just created down at the base of the painting. Now because we're incorporating this application on so many areas of the painting, we're creating something very cohesive, right? In color, in texture, in application, and it all looks like it's very natural. I generally advise when you're working on a landscape or a piece of nature from your imagination, try to incorporate similar subjects throughout your painting so that each area looks like it matches each other area. It'll just make the painting look much more cohesive and like everything has a rightful place in the painting. Here now we're adding in some additional reflective light to the rocks, and I'm still trying to create fairly sharp rocks in different areas, fairly soft rocks in others. Be mindful of the rocks and their settings, right? Because if there's a lot of heavy wind in an area or a lot of water moving over an area of rocks for a long period of time, it'll begin to erode, it'll become much more soft, and you will lose those hard edges. Where other scenarios where those don't exist, you'll get much more of a harder rock. So just be mindful of that. I don't think most people who look at a painting or a picture will ever think of that, but I think there's something subconscious in the back of our brains that look at that sort of thing and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Now here I'm switching over to my smaller square-headed brush, and I'm beginning to outline the edges of my trees with little strokes, as you can see. And I'm doing this through little strokes initially because I want to build a little bit of a texture along the edges of these trees. I don't want them to be this perfect, pristine, clean edge. I want it to look like there are knots and little pieces of bark are protruding, and it's much more captivating and interesting this way. But I'm essentially adding these highlights to the edges that are closest to the light itself, and I'm allowing it to wrap its way around the tree in the same way that we did the rocks. There's a bit of a blend going on, and there's also a bit of a tapping going on, so you could also liken it to the foliage as well. It's kind of a healthy combination of the two. Remember, the highlight that we create is going to change depending upon the subject that it's on. Here you can see a lot of a little tapping motion with that. Now here I'm taking the smaller round-headed brush that we used initially for the water, and I'm applying some highlights back into that as well. Acrylic paints innately dry fairly transparently, and they can also dry a little bit darker. So it's important that we continuously go back and add highlights to the areas that need it. Here, I needed to add it to the tops of the waterfalls, and I have a little bit of it blending down. Not a lot though, because again, remember, it's important to note that there is going to be more shadow and less light as we move farther downwards. Here I'm taking some additional highlights of the greens and the yellows that we worked on, and I'm applying those back into the foliage here as well with that same tapping motion. Hey there, it's Ryan O'Rourke. I truly hope you enjoyed today's little extra video. It was essentially a cut-up version of one of the many hour-long lessons which we offer over on patreon.com. Over there you'll also find digital sketches of the 10-minute painting lessons, digital sketches of these hour-long painting lessons, and a bunch of reference photos as well. So if any of that interests you, or if you just want to support the channel, go over there and check it out. It is a pleasure to make these long form videos, and I love to share them with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with a new video, and above all, as always, stay creative.